Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Today, we are opening up a file that I think most people feel they already have a handle on. We're looking at the Tang dynasty.
Right. And usually when you pull that file, you're looking for poetry.
Yeah.
You're looking for Li Bai, maybe some beautiful calligraphy, the art, the culture. It's the golden age.
And that's absolutely a valid lens. It was a time of just immense cultural flourishing. But today, our mission is a little different. We are going to strip away the silk and look at the steel underneath it all.
Okay.
Because, you don't build a hegemony that stretches from the Korean Peninsula all the way to modern-day Afghanistan just by writing good poetry.
No, you do it with a war machine.
Precisely. We are doing a deep dive into the Tang military. We want to look at the mechanics of how they actually conquered most of Asia, the ironclad cavalry, the industrial-scale crossbow production, the logistics behind it all.
But not just how it works, right? Because we're also going to look at the flaw.
The structural flaw, the specific defect in their military organization that will eventually cause the whole thing to blow up in one of the most destructive rebellions in all of human history.
It's interesting you use the word machine, because looking at the research, that's exactly what it feels like. It wasn't just a random collection of armies. It was a system.
A very deliberate system.
But before we get into the gears and the levers of that machine, we have to talk about the people who built it. The operators. The House of Lai.
The ruling family.
Yeah. And I think there's a common misconception here. We often picture a Chinese emperor as this, very sedentary, purely Confucian scholar who sits in a palace and writes decrees.
Right, surrounded by books.
Exactly. But the Li family, they weren't really that, were they?
Not at all. And if you miss this one point, you really miss the entire reason for their early success. The Li family came from the Northwest military aristocracy, the Guangdong region. And, genetically, culturally, they were a fusion.
A hybrid.
A complete hybrid. They were Han Chinese, yes, but they had significant Xianbei ancestry.
And the Jianbei, just to remind everyone, were these nomadic steppe people who had dominated northern China for centuries before.
Exactly. So the founders of the Tang, especially someone like Emperor Taizong, they were, Sino-Turkic in their whole outlook. They were amphibious, culturally speaking.
Amphibious. I like that.
They could sit in the capital, Shang, wear the silk robes, quote, Confucius, and manage this vast, complex bureaucracy. But they could also put on trousers, get on a horse, hunt with a falcon, and speak the language of the Turkic Khagans on the steppe. They understood both worlds.
Which seems like a massive geopolitical advantage. I mean, it's one thing to be able to fight your enemies. It's another thing entirely to understand the game they're playing on the steppe.
That's it, precisely.
Yep.
Previous dynasties, they looked at the steppe and saw this terrifying alien world, something they needed to build a great wall against.
A barrier.
A barrier. The Tang looked at the steppe and saw a political arena, a place they could not just defend against, but actively manipulate and eventually dominate. They didn't just want to be the emperor of China. They wanted to be the Khagan of the steppe.
So let's look at how they established that power. We're dropping in around 618 CE. The dynasty before them, the Sui, has just collapsed into absolute chaos. It's a free-for-all.
It is a complete battle royale for control of China. And out of this chaos rises Li Yuan, who becomes Emperor Gaozu, and his incredibly talented son, Li Shimin, the future Emperor Taizong.
And they had to fight for every single inch of ground. This wasn't handed to them.
Not at all. And the moment that really defines the Tang way of war, the kind of proof of concept for their entire military doctrine, is the Battle of Hulao in 621 CE.
This battle is just wild. The numbers on paper, they don't make any sense. Li Shimin is massively outnumbered. He's basically surrounded by rival warlords Du Jian and Wang Shichong.
He's facing two enormous armies. It should have been the end of him. But Li Shimin brings something new, or at least perfected, to the table. He has this elite corps of ironclad, heavy cavalry.
Ironclad. Can we be specific here? What does that actually mean? Are we talking chainmail, plate armor?
We are talking heavy lamellar armor. So small, overlapping plates laced together. And it wasn't just the rider, the horse was armored too. This is incredibly expensive, high-maintenance shock cavalry.
The tanks of their day.
The absolute tanks of their day. And Li Shimin uses them like a surgeon's scalpel. He seizes the Hulao Pass, which is a natural choke point, and he just waits.
That's the part I find amazing, the patience.
Incredible patience. He lets the enemy army, Dijian, this massive force, deploy in front of the pass. They stand there in formation all day. They're getting hungry, they're thirsty, they're exhausted. Their discipline starts to sag.
And Li Shimin is just watching this whole time.
He's on a high point with his personal staff, just observing. He waits until about noon when he sees enemy soldiers actually starting to sit down, breaking ranks to get a drink of water.
And that's the signal, the moment of weakness.
That is the go signal. He unleashes the heavy cavalry, but it isn't just a blind, headlong charge. This is what the sources call coordinate tactics.
So it's a system.
It's a system. He uses the terrain to funnel the enemy, he has his infantry pin them in place, and then he drives this armored wedge of horsemen straight into the enemy's command structure. He personally leads the charge.
He leads it himself.
Oh, yeah. He shatters an army of over 100,000 men with just a few thousand elite troops. It was a masterpiece of timing and shock action.
So that battle really creates the template for them, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Heavy cavalry as the hammer to break the enemy line, and disciplined infantry as the anvil to hold them in place.
That's the formula.
But here's the question that always comes up for me with these kinds of high-performance elite armies. Who pays for all this? You can't just keep tens of thousands of professional soldiers on the state payroll forever. It's too expensive.
And you have hit on the single most important institution of the early Tang military. The answer to your question is the fubing system.
The militia.
Yes, but the word militia is a bit misleading. It might make you think of, some guys with pitchforks.
Right, farmers called up for an emergency.
This was a highly structured, state-sponsored system. It was built on the foundation of the equal field land system. The deal was actually pretty simple.
What was the deal?
The state gives your family a plot of land to farm for life. In exchange for this land, you do not pay the standard grain tax. Your tax is paid in blood. You owe the state military service.
So it's almost like a feudal contract, but managed by the central government.
In a way, yes. These were designated military households, and it was often hereditary. They were a class of farmer soldiers, and the real brilliance of the system was the logistics.
Oh.
The state didn't have to foot the entire bill. The soldier was required to provide his own basic equipment, his bow, his uniform, and, critically, his own rations for the initial part of a campaign.
So that pushes the overhead costs way, way down. The government gets what is effectively a standing army for a fraction of the cost of a purely professional or mercenary force.
Exactly. And there's a social benefit, too, because these guys own land, they have skin in the game, they aren't just drifting mercenaries fighting for pay, they are property owners fighting to protect the very system that guarantees their family's livelihood.
Okay, that makes sense. But there's a huge risk there, right? If you have all these trained, armed men scattered all over the countryside, what stops a local governor from just saying, hey, everyone with a sword, come to my house, we're going to march on the capital? Warlordism.
That is the eternal paranoia of Chinese governance, and it's a very valid concern. The Tang solution to this was elegant and, frankly, genius. It was called the Bronze Tally.
I love this mechanism. It feels like something out of a spy movie, like the two-key nuclear launch system.
That's a perfect analogy. It's exactly that. The emperor in the capital had one half of a bronze token, usually shaped like a tiger. The local unit commander out in the province had the other half.
And they have to match.
They have to match perfectly. You could not legally mobilize your troops unless an imperial messenger arrived from the capital carrying the emperor's half, and the two pieces fit together.
So it creates a physical, hardware-level check on a general's power. You can't just talk your way into a rebellion. You literally need the key from the emperor.
Right. And on top of that, they geographically loaded the deck in their favor. They concentrated the vast majority of these fubing militia units in the Guanzhong region, which is the area right around the capital, Cheng'an.
So the emperor was always sitting in the middle of the biggest, most powerful concentration of troops in the empire.
Always. Any potential rebel on the frontier would have to fight his way through the heartland, which was also the most heavily garrisoned region. It was a very clever design.
It's brilliant. Now, we mentioned the cavalry was the tip of the spear. You can't have a cavalry without horses, obviously. And I was reading the notes on the Mazheng, the horse administration. The scale of this operation is just staggering.
It's industrial. You have to put yourself in their mindset. For the Tang, horses were a strategic resource. They were like oil or uranium is for us today. If you ran out of war horses, you lost the war against the nomads, period.
because their primary enemies are the Turks, the various steppe peoples. And you simply cannot catch a Turkic archer on his steppe pony if you're on foot.
You're just a target at that point. So the state made horse breeding a national priority. They set up these enormous state-run pastures, mostly in the northwest where the grazing land was best.
And we have numbers on this, right?
We do. We have data from the Lind era, which is around 665 CE. At that point, the Tang state officially owned 706,000 horses.
706,000. Just stop and think about that. The logistical footprint of that, the sheer amount of grazing land, the fodder, the veterinarians, the stable hands.
It was a massive branch of the government dedicated just to keeping the army's horsepower going. But it was also deeply ingrained in the culture. Emperor Taizong, for example, was obsessed with his war horses.
Right, the 6 steeds of Zhao Ling.
Yes, he commissioned these famous stone reliefs of his 6 favorite battle chargers to be placed at his tomb. He wrote poems about them. This wasn't just, military equipment to him. It was part of the martial identity of the entire ruling class. These were comrades in arms.
So we have the men, we have the horses. Let's get into the gear, the kit.
Yeah.
Because when you look at Tang-era art, the tomb guardians, the temple statues, the armor is incredibly distinctive. It has a very particular look.
It does. What you're probably seeing in most of those statues is the iconic Mingguangjia, the mirror armor.
Mirror armor. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel. What was the actual function of it?
Well, it was a type of lamellar armor, but its distinguishing feature was these 2 large, circular, highly polished metal plates worn on the chest and back over the main armor.
Okay, so like extra protection for the vitals.
Exactly. It's an extra deflector plate for a sword thrust or an arrow. But there was almost certainly a psychological element to it as well.
What do you mean?
Imagine a regiment of these soldiers advancing on a sunny day. The glare coming off hundreds of these polished discs would be blinding. It would be disorienting and intimidating. It made them look almost supernatural.
So it's a form of dazzle camouflage, but for intimidation.
I think so. And for high-ranking officers, they wore something even more intricate called shanwenkai, or mountain pattern armor.
Mountain pattern?
Yeah, the individual scales were shaped and interlocked in a way that resembled the Chinese character for mountain. We still aren't 100% sure how they constructed it because it's so complex, but it was clearly a high-prestige item, a status symbol on the battlefield.
And was this kind of heavy armor widely issued? Or was this just for the palace guard and the elites?
The protection rates were surprisingly high. Our sources suggest that somewhere around 60% of the active combat troops were issued with some form of armor.
60%. That is a very, very high ratio for a pre-modern army in the 7th century.
It is. It speaks to the wealth and the organizational capacity of the early Tang state.
Now, beyond armor, we have to talk about the weapon that the Tang really industrialized, that they perfected as a system, the crossbow.
Yes.
I think in the West, we often associate the crossbow with the later Middle Ages, with battles like Crécy or Agincourt, but the Chinese have been using them for centuries. The Tang, though, seem to have turned it into a factory line process.
They absolutely did. They didn't see the crossbow as just a soldier's weapon. They treated it as an artillery system. The fundamental problem with a crossbow, of course, is the reload time. It's very slow.
Right. You fire your one shot, and then you're incredibly vulnerable for 30 seconds or a minute while you're cranking it back.
So the Tang military drilled their crossbowmen to perfection in the counter-march volley fire technique. It's laid out in military manuals like the Tai Bai Yin Jing.
How did that work? Exactly.
You'd have your crossbowmen arranged in multiple rows, say 3 deep. The first row steps up, aims, and fires. The moment they've shot, they immediately turn and retire to the back of the formation to reload.
And as they're moving back, the next row is stepping up.
Precisely. Row 2 steps up, fires, and retires. Then row 3 steps up and fires. By the time row 3 has shot their bolt, row 1 is finished reloading and is ready to step forward again.
It effectively turns a slow-firing weapon into a machine gun. You create a continuous, uninterrupted wall of bolts flying at the enemy.
That's the idea. It's designed to stop a cavalry charge dead in its tracks. And they scaled this concept up dramatically. They had the Tuangzi Nu, which translates to bed crossbows.
Bed crossbows?
Yeah, these were massive siege crossbows, essentially ballistae, mounted on large wooden frames. They were so powerful they sometimes fired multiple bolts at once, or even projectiles that looked more like small spears.
And what was the range on something like that?
The sources, which might be a bit exaggerated, claim effective ranges of up to 1,160 yards.
Over a kilometer. That's That's modern sniping range.
It's an incredible distance, and aiming these things wasn't just pointing and shooting. It required specialized mathematical knowledge to calculate the trajectory. They had dedicated artillery officers whose whole job was the technical operation of these siege engines.
So this wasn't a barbarian horde. This was a professional, technical military corps.
Very much so.
And what about for the close-in fighting? When the lines inevitably clash and it gets messy.
For close quarters work, the standard sidearm was the hangdao, a straight, single-edged sword. But the real cavalry killer for the infantry was the modao.
The mogao. This is my personal favorite piece of Tang military kit.
It's terrifying. It's a heavy, two-handed, double-edged polearm. Think of it as a massive sword on a long handle, almost like a Chinese version of a glaive or an ajinata.
An anti-cavalry can opener.
That's a good way to put it. There are accounts from military theorists like General Li Jing about deploying modao troops in dense formations. They would form a wall of blades and literally advance into an enemy cavalry charge, chopping at the horses' legs and then the riders as they fell.
Wow.
The chronicles describe them as chopping their way through enemy formations. It's brutal, but incredibly effective.
So you have this incredibly versatile machine. You've got high-tech armor, massive horse reserves, disciplined volley fire from crossbows, and terrifying shock infantry. And now they turn this entire system outward beyond the borders of China proper.
This is where we get the concept of the heavenly Kagan.
Right, 630 CE. This is really the zenith of Emperor Taizong's power. The Eastern Turks had been the big threat on the northern frontier for generations. They had raided right into the gates of the capital.
It was a huge humiliation. So Taizong sends his best general, Li Jing, the same guy who wrote about the modao, and Li Jing pulls a move that is just pure, calculated audacity.
The raid on Dingxiang.
The raid on Dingxiang. He takes a small force, just 3,000 elite cavalry, and he rides deep into the steppe at night in the middle of winter. He launches a surprise attack directly on the Turkic Khan's personal headquarters.
Just 3,000 guys.
That's the key. The Turks are completely stunned. They look out and see this Tang cavalry in their camp, and they assume this must be the vanguard of a massive 100,000-man army. Because who would be insane enough to attack the heart of the Khanate with just 3,000 men?
He bluffed them with his own insane confidence.
He did. Panic spreads like wildfire. The Turkic Khanate, which was already suffering from internal divisions, just collapses. The Khan is captured. And in the aftermath, the tribal leaders of the steppe do something completely unprecedented.
What's that?
They collectively petition the Tang emperor, and they proclaim him Tian Kehan, the heavenly Khanan.
And this isn't just a fancy new title. This fundamentally changes the nature of the Tang Empire, doesn't it?
Fundamentally. He is now a two-headed sovereign. To the farmers in the agricultural heartland of China, he is the son of heaven, the traditional Chinese emperor. But to the nomads of the north, he is now their supreme Khan. He rules both worlds.
Which means he can now legally and legitimately recruit Turkic generals and Turkic cavalry directly into the Tang army.
And he does. The Tang army becomes this incredible hybrid force. You have the discipline and logistics of the Chinese infantry and bureaucracy mixed with the mobility and archery skill of the steppe cavalry. It was the best of both worlds.
And that potent combination is what explains how they managed to push so far to the west. They go into the Tarim Basin, what's modern-day Xinjiang. They start taking the oasis cities one by one. Kucha, Karasar.
This is all about controlling the Silk Road. It's about money. It's about controlling the flow of goods and, more importantly, the taxes from that trade.
And they just keep going. They defeat the Western Turks in 657 and extend Tang influence all the way to the Aral Sea. They set up the Protectorate General to pacify the West.
I mean, just picture that for a moment. You have a Chinese garrison commander, a Tang official, sitting in a fortress in what is now Central Asia, issuing travel permits to Persian merchants. That was the reality of the Tang Imperium at its height.
It's a truly cosmopolitan empire. But while they're having all this success in the West, they hit a real grinder in the East, the war in Korea.
Yes, the Goguryeo-Tang War. Korea was a very tough nut to crack. The terrain is rugged and mountainous, and the Goguryeo kingdom had built a series of formidable fortresses. This wasn't the open steppe where Tang cavalry could dominate.
Taizong tried to invade himself, didn't he, in 645?
He did. He led a massive amphibious and land assault, but he got bogged down at the siege of Ansi Fortress.
This is the famous siege where they tried to build an artificial mountain.
It is. The Tang engineers spent months building this massive earthen ramp, a siege mound, intended to overlook and dominate the walls of Ansi. And then, right as it was about to be completed, a section of it collapsed. And it collapsed in a way that it actually formed a bridge onto the city walls. The Korean defenders swarmed out, captured the siege mound, and turned its fortifications against the Tang army.
That is unbelievably humiliating. You spend months building the perfect high ground only for the enemy to capture it and use it against you.
Taizong was furious. He eventually had to withdraw. It was one of his few major military defeats. But the Tang were incredibly persistent. They didn't give up.
They switched strategies.
They switched strategies. They formed an alliance with another of the Korean kingdoms, Silla, in the south. And this new alliance leads to a really fascinating and often overlooked naval clash in 663, the Battle of Baekgang.
This one involves Japan, right?
It does. The Yamato court in Japan sent a large fleet to support Baekje, who were enemies of the Tang and Silla. So you get this major naval battle, a Tang-Silla fleet versus a Baekje-Yamato Japanese fleet.
And how did that go?
The Tang fleet, with superior shipbuilding technology and tactics, absolutely dismantled the Japanese fleet. They burned hundreds of their ships to the waterline. It was a decisive victory that effectively ended major Japanese intervention on the Asian mainland for the next 900 years.
Wow. So by the late 600s, early 700s, the map of the Tang Empire is just enormous. But here's the problem with big maps, right?
Yeah.
The commute is a killer.
And this is section 4 in our outline. And it is, for me, the most critical part of this entire analysis. The fubing militia system, that beautiful, efficient, low-cost model we were so impressed by earlier.
Yeah.
It was designed for short, defensive wars fought close to home. You mobilize your farmer soldiers, you fight a campaign, and then you send them home in time for the harvest.
But if you're fighting a permanent garrison war in Afghanistan or a multi-decade campaign in Korea, you are not going home for the harvest.
You are never going home. The tours of duty stretch from months into years and then into entire careers. The soldiers' farms back home in China went fallow. Their families couldn't maintain the land and fell into debt. The entire economic engine of the militia system seized up.
So soldiers just started deserting.
They deserted, or they simply died of old age on some remote frontier post. The system was breaking down.
So the government has to pivot. They can't rely on the citizen militia anymore?
They have no choice. They switched to the GN system. These are long-service professional soldiers, mercenaries, essentially.
Which, from a purely military perspective, solves one problem. You get better, more experienced full-time soldiers.
Right.
But it creates a massive political problem.
A catastrophic one.
Yeah.
A militiaman, in theory, fights for his home, his land, his emperor. A professional soldier fights for the man who signs his paycheck.
And that man wasn't the emperor anymore.
Not directly. Because the empire was so vast, the emperor in Chang'an couldn't possibly manage these new professional armies on the frontiers directly, so he had to appoint regional military governors to do it for him, the jidushi.
And these jidushis were given enormous power. They were allowed to collect their own regional taxes to pay their own troops. They commanded their own armies.
They essentially became mini emperors in their own domains. By the year 742, the frontier commands, led by these jidushi, controlled nearly 500,000 troops.
500,000. And what about the central army back in the capital?
It had withered away. It was a shadow of its former self, mostly ceremonial. The real military power of the Tang dynasty had shifted from the center to the edges. The loyalty of the soldiers was no longer to the emperor, but to their local general.
It's a powder keg waiting for a spark. And externally, they also hit a wall, didn't they?
Sure.
751 CE, the Battle of Talas.
Yes. Talas is one of the great what-ifs of world history. You have the Tang army pushing eastward from their Central Asian protectorates, bumping into the armies of the expanding Abbasid Caliphate, pushing westward.
The Chinese Empire versus the Islamic Caliphate. A heavyweight title fight on the roof of the world.
And for several days, it was a brutal stalemate. The battle was fought in the Talas River Valley in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, but the Tang commander, Guo Ziyi, had made a critical error. A large portion of his army was made up of allied Karluk Turkic mercenaries.
And mercenaries can be fickle.
In the middle of the battle, the Karluks switched sides. They betrayed the Tang and attacked them from the rear.
The classic steppe betrayal.
It turned the battle into a slaughter. The Tang army was routed. Only a few thousand, including the commander Guo Ziyi, managed to escape.
Now, I've always heard this battle credited with being the moment that paper-making technology was transferred from China to the West. Is that true?
It is. Among the prisoners the Abbasids captured were Chinese artisans who knew the secrets of papermaking. They were taken to Samarkand, and soon you have paper mills popping up across the Islamic world, which is a technology that eventually finds its way to Europe.
So, in a way, civilization wins, but the Tang definitely lost.
Yes. Strategically, Talis wasn't an empire-ending catastrophe in itself, but it was symptomatic of the bigger problem. The Tang had overextended. Their supply lines were too long, their alliances were fragile, their westward expansion was over.
So the expansion is stopped. The political structure is a time bomb. And that brings us to the man who lights the fuse, the villain of the story, and Lushan.
And Lucian is such a fascinating and complex character. He was of Sogdian and Turkic origin, not Han Chinese. By all accounts, he was enormous obese, even, but he was also incredibly charming and politically savvy.
He played the court politics game very well.
Perfectly. He became a favorite of the aging Emperor Xuanzang and, famously, his beloved consort, Yang Guifei. He played the part of the simple, loyal, barbarian soldier to perfection.
Oh, I'm just a simple soldier, Your Majesty. I love the Emperor.
All while he was quietly amassing an unprecedented amount of military power. Through political maneuvering, he got himself appointed as the Judushi of not one, not two, but three major military regions in the Northeast.
Agree. So he personally controlled how many troops?
He had sole command of about 164,000 of the best, most battle-hardened professional soldiers in the entire empire.
And he's sitting up there on the frontier with his massive private army, while the capital is basically undefended.
That was the fatal imbalance. And in 755, he decided he didn't want to be a subordinate anymore. He wanted the throne.
He rebelled.
He mobilized his army and marched south, and because the old feuding system was dead and the capital had no real army to defend it, there was almost nothing to stop him. It wasn't really a war at first. It was a parade.
He just walked in.
He took the secondary capital, Luoyang, with ease. Then, in 756, he took the main capital, Chang'an. The emperor, the great Emperor Xuanzang, the man who had presided over the high point of the Golden Age, had to flee the city in the middle of the night, a refugee in his own country.
The psychological shock of that. The son of heaven, the heavenly Kagan, running for his life from one of his own generals.
It broke the dynasty's soul. It shattered the aura of invincibility the Tang had built over a century. And the war that followed, it wasn't quick. It dragged on for 8 long years, and it was apocalyptic.
To understand the sheer desperation of this period, we have to talk about the siege of Suyang in 757.
We do, and it's a very tough story to tell.
So the Tang general Zhang Xun was holding the city of Suyang against a massive rebel army.
And Suyang was a strategic linchpin. It controlled access to the Grand Canal. If Suyang fell, the rebels could move south and seize the fertile Jiangnan region. That was the breadbasket of the empire. If the rebels got the rice and the tax revenue from the south, the Tang cause was finished.
So Zhang Xun had to hold out at all costs.
At all costs. He held the city for 10 months, but they ran out of food. They ate the horses, then they ate the rats and the birds, then they boiled the leather from their armor and their bowstrings and ate that, and then the historical sources are very specific and very grim. They turned to cannibalism. Zhang Xun reportedly killed his own concubine to feed his starving troops to keep their morale up. Then they began executing the old, the young, the women, the civilian population to feed the remaining soldiers.
It's just horrific.
Mm-hmm.
But from a cold strategic point of view.
Strategically, it worked. He held the rebel army there for so long, he bled them dry. He bought the Tang court enough time to regroup and organize a counterattack. But the cost was their humanity.
And even with that sacrifice, the Tang couldn't win the war on their own, could they?
No. This shows you how weak and desperate they had become. To retake the capitals, they had to make a deal with the Uyghur Khaganate, another powerful steppe empire.
What was the deal?
The deal was this. Help us defeat the rebels and recapture our capital city, and we will give you the right to loot it for 3 days.
Let me get this straight. The legitimate government of China invited a foreign army to come in and sack their own capital city just to get it back from the rebels.
Yes. Imagine the message that sends. It was a sign of total moral and military bankruptcy. The government was willing to sacrifice its own people to keep the throne.
So they eventually suppressed the rebellion.
They do. And Lushan himself was assassinated by his own son in a palace coup. The war finally sputtered out by 763. But the Tang dynasty that survived was a ghost of its former self.
The census numbers from before and after the war are just terrifying. Some estimates suggest tens of millions of people are just missing from the records?
Now, that's a contentious number. Some were certainly killed, but many were just displaced, or the government's ability to even count them had collapsed. But either way, the tax base was shattered, the economy was in ruins.
And politically, the genie was out of the bottle.
It was. The central government was too weak to defeat all the remaining rebel generals on the battlefield. So they made deals with them. They basically sent them letters saying, okay, if you stop fighting us and pledge nominal allegiance, we will officially appoint you as the legal governor, the judici of the province you currently occupy.
So the rebels became a government?
They did. We call this new system the Fanzen, the regional commands. In the Hebei region, in the northeast, these former rebel provinces became independent kingdoms in all that name. They didn't send taxes to the capital. They appointed their own officials. The governors passed their titles down to their own sons.
So the map might have said Tang Empire, but the reality was a fractured patchwork of warlord states.
Exactly.
And yet somehow the dynasty limps on for another 150 years. How is that even possible?
It's a combination of sheer inertia, some clever diplomacy, and a few last brilliant individuals. You have to mention Guo Ziyi. He's like the last hero of the Tang, the Captain America of this period.
He's the bluff master, right?
The absolute master.
Right.
In 763, the Tibetans, seeing the Tang were weak, invaded and actually sacked Chang'an. Guo Ziyi was sent to deal with them. He had maybe 4,000 tired troops against a massive Tibetan army of 100,000.
Impossible odds.
So he resorted to deception. He had his men light thousands of campfires at night and beat drums and gongs, creating the illusion that a massive Tang relief army had arrived. The Tibetans panicked and retreated.
And what about the time he rode into the Uyghur camp, completely unarmed?
That was in 765. The Uyghurs and the Tibetans had formed an alliance to attack the Tang. Guo Ziyi had a long history with the Uyghurs. They respected him personally. He rode into their main camp with just a handful of attendants, no armor, no weapons.
That's insane.
He just walked up to the Uyghur chiefs and said, "We were allies. Why are you betraying us to side with our enemies?" The Uyghurs were so stunned and impressed by his personal courage that they switched sides right there on the spot and helped him fight the Tibetans.
That's the stuff of movies. But you can't build a stable government on the charisma of one aging general. The internal rot was getting worse. And now we see the rise of a new, insidious power center, the court eunuchs.
This is the final cancer that eats the dynasty from the inside out. The emperors, after Anlushon, were terrified of their own generals. They didn't trust them.
Understandably.
So to protect themselves, they created a new elite palace army called the Shent's Army, the Divine Strategy Army, and they put court eunuchs in command of it.
Why eunuchs?
The thinking was, well, eunuchs can't have children. They have no families or loyalties outside the palace. They will be personally loyal to me, the emperor.
That was a big mistake.
A huge, catastrophic mistake. The eunuchs quickly realized that if they controlled the only effective army near the capital, they controlled everything. By the 9th century, the chief eunuchs were the real power behind the throne. They were literally deciding who got to be emperor. They would murder emperors they didn't like and install pliable children they could control as puppets.
So you have independent warlords running the provinces, you have eunuchs running the palace, and the economy is a wreck. Feels like the whole thing is just waiting for one final push to collapse.
And that push comes in the late 800s with the Hongqiao Rebellion.
And Wanqiao was different from An Lushan, right?
Completely different. And Lushan was an insider, a general who wanted to take over the system and rule it himself. Hongqiao was an outsider. He was a failed scholar who became the leader at a massive peasant uprising fueled by famine, floods, and crushing taxes. He didn't want to rule the system.
He wanted to burn the system to the ground.
Exactly. His rebellion was aimed at the entire aristocratic class. He systematically targeted and wiped out the old noble clans. The great families that had dominated Chinese society and government for 1,000 years were massacred. When the dust settled from the Hongqiao Rebellion, the entire social structure of medieval China was gone.
And in 907, the last Tang emperor, a child, is forced to abdicate by one of these new warlords. The lights finally go out on the Tang dynasty.
And China enters the chaotic period of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. Total fragmentation.
So looking back at this whole deep dive, it's a tragic story. The Tang created what was arguably the ultimate military machine for its time. They figured out how to combine the discipline of China with the mobility of the steppe.
A perfect synthesis.
But they failed the software update. They couldn't figure out how to transition from their successful early-stage militia model to a professional standing army without creating the very warlords who would tear the empire apart.
That is the essential lesson and the great legacy of the Tang military. The next great dynasty, the Song, looked back at the horror of the Aleutian Rebellion and said, never again. They built their entire state around the principle of subordinating the military to the civilian government.
So they were weaker militarily.
Much weaker, yes. They were constantly on the defensive, but they were internally stable for centuries. They learned the hard lesson that a sword that is too sharp and too powerful eventually cuts the hand of the person who holds it.
A lesson bought with tens of millions of lives. This has been a fascinating and sobering look under the hood of the Golden Age.
Indeed it has.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.